Well, good afternoon, everyone. Well, technically it's still morning, but I do want to thank you on behalf of the OSD History Office, Dr. Mahan, and the Air Force History Museums program. I do want to thank you for being here and attending this session. Our speaker today, Dr. Mark Clodfelter, is well known to students of Air Power. Dr. Clodfelter is currently a professor of military strategy at the National War College. During his 23-year career as an Air Force officer, he taught history twice at the Air Force Academy and served as the Academy's Director of Military History. He was also part of the initial cadre of instructors at the School of Advanced Air and Space Studies. He served as commander of the Air Force ROTC detachment at the University of North Carolina. His published books include The Limits of Air Power, The American Bombing of North Vietnam, and Beneficial Bombing, The Progressive Foundations of American Air Power, 1917 to 1945. He has also written monographs, numerous journal articles, and contributions to other volumes. Dr. Clodfelter earned a Bachelor of Science in European History from the Air Force Academy, an MA in Military History from the University of Nebraska, and his PhD in American History from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He is an avid fan of Air Force football, North Carolina basketball, and St. Louis Cardinals baseball. His presentation today is on the air wars in Vietnam. Please join me in giving a warm welcome and your full attention to Dr. Clodfelter.
Thanks very much there, John. Yeah, my graduate degrees are I have a master's in football from Nebraska and a PhD in basketball from Carolina. So I wanted to begin by answering a question that perhaps some of you guys might have. You're going, okay, it's Gray. Was he there? Let me just say that I was a senior in high school when Richard Nixon ran his great Linebacker II bombing offensive in December of 1972, the so-called Christmas bombings. And the only thing I truly remember about that month was in that month I received a nomination to the Air Force Academy. Now, when I got to the Air Force Academy there in the summer of 1973 and then was there for 4 more years, every instructor we had, blue suit, wings over the left pocket, and all of them, to a man, said, you know, if we had done what Richard Nixon did there with the B-52s there in early 1965, we could have ended that war in less than a month. And I thought to myself, well, those guys were there. They saw it. Many of them flew the missions over the North. So I thought, they probably know what's what. And so when I did my research on the air wars in Vietnam, that was my going-in premise, that we, the United States, could have won the war with air power had we applied it properly in 1965. Needless to say, after I got into doing that research, my thesis changed. What I want to talk with you guys today about is indeed the air wars in Vietnam. And notice, it's not air war, it's air wars, because you have a multiplicity of air wars taking place in Southeast Asia that are totally disconnected from one another, isolated, no one guy in charge, and that is a key reason that today we have the Joint Forces Air Component Commander, the JFAC, to try and correct many of the problems we had in Vietnam. Now, all of those air wars combined will drop 8 million tons of bombs on Southeast Asia. That is roughly 5 times the amount of bombs that were dropped by all Allied air forces in World War II. What I want to do is to give you a run-through of those various wars, but I'm going to spend most of my time talking about the air war that was emphasized the most by the Navy, the Air Force, and the 2 presidents of the United States during the Vietnam War, and that is the air war over North Vietnam. But first of all, I'll take a look at the in-country air wars in South Vietnam. And what it says in-country, that simply means the air wars occurring in the airspace above the country of South Vietnam. And there you have no less than 6 simultaneously occurring air wars, all completely disconnected, dissociated from one another. First of all, you had the air war that was conducted by the greatest air force in South Vietnam. That was certainly not the Army, or certainly not the air forces, it was the armies. And that is the Army with its air mobile, air support, air cavalry. It will have ultimately 12,000 helicopters sent to South Vietnam. Of that total, 12,000 that are supporting Army forces all over the country of South Vietnam, 5,000 will be shot down. 2,700 air crew members will be killed. But that by far is the greatest air war occurring during the Vietnam War. You also have the air war conducted by the Marines and their air forces here in the area known as I Corps, directly south of the DMZ, the 17th parallel. And there you've got a wide number of Marine helicopters, but you've also got fixed-wing aircraft, your F-4s, your A-4s, your A-6s, all supporting Marine combat operations on the ground. In addition, you have the Navy's air war in South Vietnam. You have 2 carriers stations, one in the Gulf of Tonkin that will contribute a little bit, that's known as Yankee Station, to support American forces on the ground here, but more importantly to support those, you have a carrier task force at Dixie Station in the south that will support American forces throughout South Vietnam. Again, flying the same fixed-wing aircraft as the Marines, F-4s, A-4s, A-6s for the most part. And then you have the Air Force's fighter war in South Vietnam. That's controlled by Air Force headquarters, 7th Air Force headquarters at Saigon, and it consists of fighters that are stationed throughout the area of South Vietnam and also in Thailand. Your F-4s, your F-100s, your F-105s, they will be controlled by, like I said, the 7th Air Force commander at Saigon. But that's not to be confused with the Air Force's bomber war in South Vietnam. The 7th Air Force commander only wished he could control the B-52s, but he could not because they were part of the nuclear triad. So they were controlled by the Joint Chiefs of Staff through Strategic Air Command headquarters at Omaha, Nebraska. Now that's when the war began, but the Joint Chiefs soon realized that, okay, maybe we should put a commander in charge closer to the area of operations. And so they decided that they would move that to Hawaii. PACOM, commander there. And then ultimately control was transferred to the Army MACV, that's Military Assistance Command Vietnam commander there in Saigon, William Westmoreland and his successor, Creighton Abrams. But never to the 7th Air Force commander. Unity of command? Where are your bombers based? Some are based at Utapao, Thailand, close to Bangkok. The remainder, and that's the bulk of them, are based way away at Andersen Air Base, Guam. They will, together, from Utapao and Andersen, form a massive air campaign known as Arclight, attacking targets in the south, targets of the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese. How long does it take to get from Andersen to run these missions? 6 hours one way, 6 hours back. 12-hour missions. Last and perhaps least is the VNAV, the Air Force of the Vietnamese, the South Vietnamese. The Vietnamese Air Force, it consists of A-1s, A-37s, F-5s. They will fly in support of South Vietnamese, ARVN, your Army of Republic of Vietnam, operations here throughout the South. Together, these 6 various air wars will drop 4 million tons of bombs on the country of our ally, South Vietnam. Not exactly the best way to win hearts and minds. Okay, what about the out-country air wars? Those flown outside the borders of South Vietnam. And there you have 3, Laos, Cambodia, and of course, North Vietnam. In Laos, you have a campaign that begins in December of 1964, the first bombing that America does in Southeast Asia, known as Operation Barrel Roll, attacking North Vietnamese and Pathet Lao forces in this area. Then you have a campaign known as Steel Tiger, attacking the highways and byways of the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which runs roughly through Laos and will offload into South Vietnam. The North Vietnamese have 80,000 troops in Laos. Most of those are manning the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Those 2 campaigns, Barrel Roll and Steel Tiger, take place during the Lyndon Johnson administration. When Richard Nixon takes over, the bombing of North Vietnam stops for a fair amount of time, and then the bombing on Laos really picks up in a massive campaign known as Commando Hunt. The United States will drop 3 million tons of bombs on Laos. Next, you have Richard Nixon's secret bombing of Cambodia, takes place 1969-1970. These are the so-called menu operations. Different phases: breakfast, lunch, dinner, and snack. They will drop 125,000 tons of bombs on Cambodia. A mere pittance in bombing tonnages dropped in Southeast Asia, but Nixon has to keep the bombing secret. Even though Cambodian Premier Norodom Sihanouk asked him to do it. The reason is Nixon has just been elected as a peace candidate with a secret plan to end the war, and now here he is expanding the war, and he doesn't want the American public to know about it. And finally, and seemingly most importantly, you have the out-country air war against North Vietnam. That takes place and is conducted by Air Force fighters, Navy fighters, and to a very limited degree, Air Force B-52s. You have 2 massive air campaigns that occur against North Vietnam. The first, Operation Rolling Thunder, Lyndon Johnson's air campaign that begins in March of 1965 and goes until October 1968. You may wonder, where does the code name Rolling Thunder come from? Any of you guys ever sung the hymn, How Great Thou Art? I see the stars, I hear the rolling thunder. And the idea is that the thunder will roll initially starting at the 17th parallel, ultimately toward Hanoi and Haiphong, threatening those 2 cities and hoping to force the North Vietnamese to throw in the towel. Nixon's air campaign is known as linebacker. Nixon played football at Whittier College and played linebacker, and he said, hey, if an enemy mounts an offensive, the linebacker, talking about football here, the linebacker is going to be the key to stop that offense. Well, at the end of March 1972, the North Vietnamese come forth with a massive ground campaign known as the Easter Offensive. And Nixon says, air power is going to stop it, and we're going to name this campaign Linebacker. That takes place from May of 1972 until the end of October, and then Linebacker 2 will occur from the 18th of December until the 29th. 1 million tons of bombs dropped by the United States on North Vietnam. But as I mentioned earlier, to your air commanders for the Air Force and the Navy, that 1 million tons counts the most, and that's also true to the Commander-in-Chief, Lyndon Johnson, and then Richard Nixon. So I'm going to devote the rest of my time talking about that air war against the North. And in doing so, I will have 3 theses that I will give to you guys as I go through it. The first thesis is this: strategic bombing is probably not a good idea in all types of wars. Duh. I'll go further. Strategic bombing in a limited war, guerrilla war like Vietnam, is perhaps likely to hurt the nation that's doing the bombing more than it is to hurt the enemy. I will go further. In terms of an air campaign like Rolling Thunder, the bombing that is so-called strategic bombing is not only likely to hurt the nation that's doing the bombing, it's likely to help the enemy that's being bombed. Ho Chi Minh, smart guy. He knows that Rolling Thunder is going to do minimal damage to his country because of all of the political restrictions that Lyndon Johnson has placed on it. And yet, the bombing occurs on a regular basis, and Ho can point to it as a tangible sign of American aggression and use it to bolster the resolve of the North Vietnamese populace. In addition, Ho's country is being bombed. He's supported by the Chinese and the Soviets. So Ho goes to the Soviets and says, hey, I need air defenses and all sorts of other weaponry and stuff to help my people survive. And then he goes to the Chinese and says the same thing, and he points out what the Russians have done for him. So he plays off the Russians against the Chinese, and as a result, the GDP of North Vietnam goes up every year of Rolling Thunder, from 65 to 68. We bomb these guys, and their GDP increases. Meanwhile, the CIA did a study in 1966, and they found out to cause $1 worth of damage to the North Vietnamese war effort cost the United States $9.66. Not exactly cost effective. Moreover, during the 3.5 years of Rolling Thunder, we, the United States, the Air Force, and the Navy loses 938 fixed-wing aircraft and the associated number of crew members. Not exactly working out the way it was designed. So you may well be wondering, and I would say rightly so, what was the fundamental premise of Operation Rolling Thunder? What were these guys trying to achieve? And these guys is exactly right. Here you have a picture of one of the famous Tuesday lunch sessions outside the Oval Office in the White House. Every Tuesday, These individuals would meet with Lyndon Johnson. Here you see Secretary of State Dean Rusk, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, National Security Advisor Walt Rostow, and then you would have assorted dogs and cats like Clark Clifford, Abe Fortas, some of Johnson's cronies. But what you do not have is somebody in uniform in these meetings. And you do not on a regular basis until October of 1967, 2 years after Rolling Thunder has been going on. Then you finally get Buzz Wheeler, Army General, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, sitting in on a regular basis. But not until then. What does this Tuesday lunch session do? It picks the targets for bombing in North Vietnam. So, what's the fundamental premise of these guys regarding Operation Rolling Thunder? They say that the Viet Cong, the indigenous enemy in South Vietnam, cannot operate without support and direction from the North Vietnamese. They say they're not stupid. They know what the totals are in terms of intel for the enemy on the ground. On the eve of the Tet Offensive, there in late 1967, there's a 300,000-man communist army. Of that total, 250,000 are Viet Cong guerrillas. 500,000. Augmented by 50,000 North Vietnamese army in VA. But they say that this wide number of troops provided by the VC, the Viet Cong, cannot operate without the support and direction of the North Vietnamese. And thus, if you eliminate North Vietnam from the equation, you will have then succeeded in wrecking the Viet Cong and achieving Lyndon Johnson's political objective of a stable, non-communist South Vietnam. And if you do it by bombing, you don't have to commit a large number of American ground troops. Plus, bombing is so nice because it's so controllable. It's like a spigot. You can open or close depending upon the reaction of the American public, which you want, if you're Lyndon Johnson, you want focused on his Great Society social welfare programs. You don't want the public to focus on this daggone war. You want them focused on domestic welfare. And he's also trying to carefully gauge the reaction of the Soviets and the Chinese, because he's very worried if he bombs too much, they might actively intervene. By the way, the Chinese have 50,000 volunteers in North Vietnam. A lot of them manning supply routes or manning AAA, anti-aircraft artillery batteries. Problem is, Lyndon Johnson and these guys' fundamental premise is fundamentally flawed. And here is why. Charlie and thousands of his friends, the Viet Cong fight on an average during Operation Rolling Thunder 1 day a month. 1 day out of 30. That's how frequently they fight. Now, I know what many of you are probably thinking. I've seen Platoon, I've seen Rambo, I've seen Chuck Norris. Hell, they're fighting there all the time. And they certainly did in Hollywood. In actuality, no, not so much. Check out these stats. The 2 years of peak combat activity for the United States in Vietnam is 1967, 1968. If you take every American Army and Marine patrol that goes out on so-called search and destroy missions, your platoons that go out on a daily basis, for those 2 years, how many make contact with the enemy, the Viet Cong or the NVA? 1%. 1%. And if you add in the numbers of our vaunted allies, the ARVN, how many make contact with the enemy? 1/10 of 1%. They control the vertical, they control the horizontal. They fight when it suits them, when they have a chance to succeed, and they have a chance to get away. But that's it. And yet, during those 2 years of peak combat activity, Americans still die. In 1967, we lose 10,000 Americans dead. In 1968, we lose 15,000 Americans dead. 1/4 of that total, 6,000 men, die from mines and booby traps. Has a very, unfortunately, familiar ring to it. Because they fight so infrequently, the Viet Cong and the NVA, that entire 300,000-man army during the time of Operation Rolling Thunder needs, for resupply from sources outside of South Vietnam, 34 tons a day. 34 tons a day. Any of you guys ever driven a 2.5-ton truck, a deuce and a half? You know what they are, I'm sure. If you fill up 7 2.5-ton trucks, you would now have 35 tons. That's the highest total I was ever able to find that they needed on a daily basis. And I don't care how much bombing you do. You can do what Ronald Reagan said he wanted to do in 1966 when he was governor of California, and that was to bomb North Vietnam into a large parking lot. You can do that, but you cannot stop 34 tons of supplies from coming in on a daily basis. And most of that, by the way, is ammunition and medicine. You can get it in through rowboats off the coast, Laos, Cambodia. There's no way you can stop it. And thus, that premise that said the Viet Cong needed the support of the North Vietnamese, they do not. They do not. They also do not need the direction of the North Vietnamese. Pick your favorite South Vietnamese leader. Diem, Con, Ky, Chu. Paragons of virtue all, right? Yeah. They were corrupt beyond belief, out of touch with the population, and guess what? They're Catholic in a predominantly Buddhist nation. You got to be wondering then, hey, why do we Americans support these guys? Well, there's one thing they're not, and that is commie. They are not communist. And thus, anything that's not communist, it's got to be good for us. So we're backing them up. If you read only one book dealing with the enemy's perception, I would strongly suggest that that book would be a Viet Cong memoir. It's written by Trung Nhu Tong. He was Viet Cong Minister of Justice from 1967 through the end of the war. He was from a very wealthy family in Saigon. He abandoned all that to fight against the United States and the Saigon government. If you look in that book, it says he would have been willing to support any regime which had the hopes of the people foremost in their mind. None did. And if you look at that book too, he also says what was his number one goal while America was in Vietnam? 1, destroy the Saigon regime. 2, get Americans out. He had very little love lost for the NVA. And when the NVA came down and tried to work with him, they also brought their political cadres, which tried to educate the Viet Cong. And he had no time for that. So this is my first premise. The way Americans applied air power in Vietnam during Operation Rolling Thunder did not suit the character of the war there. Second, I would say this is my second premise. If America's air and naval commanders, air commanders, had it to do over again without Lyndon Johnson's onerous political restrictions, I contend they would have done it exactly the way they did. With one key exception. They would have done what Johnson did in 3.5 years in 3 months. But I would also contend this: it would have made absolutely no difference. The great constraint on American, particularly Air Force bombing in Vietnam, is Air Force doctrine. And Air Force doctrine said, if you destroy the vital centers, particularly the industrial vital centers of an enemy, you will achieve victory. And that is exactly what recently retired General Curtis LeMay meant when he said in the summer of 1965, what we should do to North Vietnam is to bomb it into the Stone Age. Now, LeMay was not one to shy away from city bombing, no doubt about that. But what LeMay meant by that statement was exactly what he said. He wanted to take away the technological capability of the North Vietnamese to wage modern war. Do that, and he contended victory would result. Now, LeMay and his cohorts were not stupid men, not at all. They knew that North Vietnam was what, 2 bricks away from being in the Stone Age anyhow? They knew that. They knew that the North Vietnamese got by far the military hardware they needed from the Soviet Union and China. And they knew that North Vietnam had, count them, 7 electric power plants, 1 cement factory, and 1 steel mill, which you see Ho Chi Minh inspecting here at Tai Nguyen. But the notion was, yeah, they got this nascent industrial establishment, but they don't want to lose what they have. And thus, we can hold it hostage. We can scare them. We can make them throw in the towel because they don't want to lose it. After all, we, the United States, made the mightiest enemy we faced on planet Earth, the Soviet Union, throw in the towel in October 1962 because of the threat of Kurt LeMay's bombers and missiles. And now you're talking Ho Chi Minh and North Vietnam? North Vietnam, which President Johnson himself refers to as a raggedy-ass, fourth-rate, pissant country. Yeah, how hard's it going to be? A couple of low passes with B-52s over Hanoi and that's it, game over. We were guilty of hubris in the extreme. If you go back and look at the memoranda and message traffic sent by air commanders there in the spring of 1965, you'll see they're not happy with this notion of gradual bombing. That doesn't thrill them at all. But if you go through and read that message traffic, they also say, well, given the nature of the enemy, it ought to be enough. We ought to be able to do it. I had the honor of interviewing former Secretary of State Dean Rusk in 1986, and he told me the greatest mistake he ever made while Secretary was underestimating the tenacity of the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese. He said he thought they would reach a stage where they would simply give up. Not to be. Now, your American air leaders, they soon realized that, hey, They're not going to fold. And by the summer of 1965, they're demanding that President Johnson do an air campaign very reminiscent of what we did to Nazi Germany, attacking transportation, oil, electric power, industry, doing all that. And ultimately, we do. And it makes no difference. And thus, the air commanders come up with a very arbitrary way to determine mission success after the failure of knocking out these components of the North Vietnamese industrial establishment does nothing. And that arbitrary way to measure success is this: sortie count. The number of sorties flown over North Vietnam on a daily basis. In the spring of 1966, the airspace over North Vietnam is divided into 7 bombing zones, known as route packages, or route packs for short. The Navy, they get 4. Big city of Haiphong. The Air Force gets 3. Big city of Hanoi. This is ostensibly done to deconflict the multitude of aircraft flying over North Vietnam so there is no midair. But say you're an Air Force commander and you want to bomb a target in the Navy zone. Can you do so? You can if you get permission from the Navy, and count on that happening. No, it's not. As a result of this decision, a bombing competition develops between the Air Force and the Navy, and thus they compete with each other for the maximum number of sorties that can be flown over North Vietnam on any given day. And the result of that is that aircraft will bomb North Vietnam carrying less than a full load of bombs. In the summer of 1967, if you were to be in Air Force General Spike Momeyer's headquarters briefing there, his daily stand-up in Saigon at 0600, he asked to see 2 slides that showed flying activity over North Vietnam from the previous day. The first slide was titled Sortie Total over North Vietnam Navy, and the second slide was titled Sortie Total over North Vietnam Air Force. And if the second slide didn't have a higher total than the first, heads rolled. But let me give it to you guys from a more personal standpoint. Notice, Tan Hoa. Tan Hoa has a rail line going through it. It also has a bridge carrying that terrain. It is the toughest target in North Vietnam. Together, the Air Force and Navy will fly 700 sorties against the Tan Hoa Bridge during Rolling Thunder and never drop it. It is very heavily defended. SAMs, AAA, all around it. Let's say that in the spring of 1966, you're an F-4 squadron commander, and this is your target, the Tan Hoa Bridge. And to hit it, you are going to be given 32 500-pound bombs. Wow. Why so generous? 32 500-pound bombs. Why? Why only 32? Well, you see, in the spring of 1966, because we've been bombing continuously in Southeast Asia, we, the United States, now has a bomb shortage. In the early 1960s, because we knew that the next war we were going to fight was going to be the big one against the Soviet Union with nukes, we sold off all of our iron bombs that were left over from World War II in Korea to our NATO allies for $1.50 apiece. In the spring of 1966, Secretary McNamara goes back to these NATO allies and says, gosh, we really need to get these bombs back. And they say, sure, no problem. $21.50 each. Slight markup. So that's why you're only going to be given 32 500-pound bombs here in the spring of 1966 to take out the now non-existent Tanwa Bridge. Okay, so you get 32 500-pound bombs. How many aircraft are you going to send? You're an F-4 squadron commander. How many aircraft are you going to send against the Tanwa Bridge? Well, one of the very few things I remember in my very distant past from the physics and aerodynamics classes at the academy was it works better if you have balanced aircraft in terms of a bomb under each wing. So, how many are you going to send? Well, if you're going to achieve that balance, you're going to go with 16. That's very, very bad news for the newest second lieutenant in the squadron, because guess what position that guy is going to have in the attack on the Tanwa Bridge? Oh yeah, he's going to be number 16 when he rolls in, and that's not just going to be last, that's going to be dead last, because at that point, trust me, the NVA, AAA, and SAMs are going to know exactly where he is going to be. This is no kidding. When I was doing the research, I had a Navy A4 pilot come up to me, and he told me, about his career. And he said, one day, I did have the mission of attacking the Tanwa Bridge. He goes, and I'm going out doing my walk around on the airplane there, and I look under the wings, and I went, that's different. I go up to the crew chief and I say, you guys are usually pretty good, but this time, for some reason, you forgot to put bombs on my airplane. And crew chief pulls out his clipboard and goes, we don't have any bombs for your airplane, sir. He goes, I'm attacking the Tanwa Bridge. Where are the bombs? Crew chief says, I don't know, sir. We don't have any listed. Pilot goes running into the tower, tracks down the CAG, and goes up to him and he says, sir, what's my mission for today? And CAG looks at him and says, Tanwa Bridge. He says, sir, are you aware that there's no bombs on my aircraft? CAG says, yeah. And the pilot looked at the CAG and said, sir, what am I supposed to do? The CAG looked him in the eyes and said, when you get there, strafe it. So the pilot told me, he got in his airplane, survived the catapult shot out there, went to Tanwa, survived the SAMs and the AAA, and he said, and I fired in the A4 with the 20 millimeter cannon, you've got about a 2-second burst. He said, so I fired my 2-second burst at the steel girders there, the Tanwa Bridge. And it was kind of like shooting a BB gun at a wrought iron fence. Came back, landed safely, and as a result of what I did, the Navy's sortie total increased by 1. There are 3 great controls that can be placed on an air campaign that will do tremendous damage to it. One, I call operational. That's the fact that you have enemy defenses, people trying to kill you. You also have to deal with bad weather, that sort of thing. Operational controls. 2, political controls. And goodness knows, with what Lyndon Johnson and the Tuesday Lunch Group was doing with Rolling Thunder, there were political controls off the scale. But 3 is military controls. The self-inflicted wounds, those can be the most devastating. And Rolling Thunder had all 3 in spades. Okay. The third part. Oh, come back. There we go. Third part of my premise. Nixon's air war, which seemingly works a lot better than Lyndon Johnson's. Now, a lot of people look and they go, yeah, the 2 weeks with the B-52s over Hanoi. Yeah, we get it. Well, Nixon's bombing actually takes place for 6 months, not 2 weeks. When the North Vietnamese launched that Easter offensive at the end of March 1972, Nixon will respond quickly with Linebacker. This is Linebacker 1, and that will go for 6 months. Linebacker 2, again, only for 2 weeks. But the targets that are hit during Nixon's Linebacker campaign in 72 are almost exactly the same targets hit during Operation Rolling Thunder for Lyndon Johnson. What happened to make Nixon's bombing work more effectively? 3 key developments. The situation changes in 3 key ways, and here's the first. When the Viet Cong come out of hiding in 1968 in the Great Tet Offensive, they wage conventional war. And when they do, American firepower decimates the Viet Cong. So the Viet Cong is destroyed as a viable fighting force there at the end of 68. Yeah, you'll have remnants here and there, but nothing like you had before. And thus, when the North Vietnamese attack there at the end of March 1972, it is a massive conventional assault, 120,000 men backed by more than 200 T-54 tanks, 130 millimeter heavy artillery. It's just like the German blitzkrieg against France in May of 1940, with one exception: no air support. But everything else pretty much the same. And let me tell you, you cannot refuel a fleet of T-54 tanks with gasoline carried in water bottles on bicycles going down the Ho Chi Minh Trail. You need trucks, you need trains, you need lots of them, and those are wonderful targets now for air power, and now air power has something it did not have during Rolling Thunder, and that is precision-guided munitions, your early smart bombs. During the first week of Linebacker 1, I believe it's the second day, you have 3 F-4s firing 3 3,000-pound laser-guided bombs into a single span of the Tan Hoa Bridge. Boom, down it goes. Those troops, they need vast quantities of gasoline and ammunition, and Linebacker is going to hurt them very badly, because now the North Vietnamese are waging a fast-paced conventional war of movement. Second, Nixonian diplomacy. No matter what you might think of Nixon as a domestic president, and that's not a whole lot good there, in terms of foreign policy, very astute. His diplomacy worked very well. Nixon is watching the world situation throughout the Vietnam War. He notes in August of 1969, the Soviets and the Chinese wage a savage border war against each other on their common frontier in Mongolia. By 1971, both sides now have 1 million men facing each other, 1 million on each side, backed by nukes. Nixon says, "I think I can take advantage of this situation." In February 1972, he goes to Beijing. For the first time, an American president's ever done that. And then in May of 1972, he goes to Moscow. The Chinese desperately want diplomatic recognition. They don't even exist in the United Nations at this point in time. They're basically an uncountry. Nixon says, "Okay, I think I can do that for you." The Russians, on the other hand, they've had a disastrous harvest. They want American wheat very badly, and they're in a very costly arms race with the United States, and they want to slow that down with SALT, Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, SALT I. Nixon says, "I think I can make that happen for you." His price to both? A free hand in dealing with North Vietnam. And he gets it. Lyndon Johnson, on the other hand, never could figure out how to deal with the Chinese or Russians, and was worried that he might push them too far. In regards to Lyndon Johnson, on foreign affairs, I must confess that the best quote I found there comes from Bernard Brodie, who said, "For Lyndon Johnson, foreign affairs were indeed foreign." And finally, what is Nixon fighting for? Lyndon Johnson was fighting for a stable, independent, non-communist South Vietnam, a very difficult goal to achieve with any type of military force, much less air power. Nixon, on the other hand, he's fighting for what he terms peace with honor, which is a euphemism for getting the heck out of Vietnam with American POWs and hoping that the South Vietnamese do not fall in the immediate aftermath of American withdrawal. In Nixon's own words, America was fighting for a decent interval for South Vietnam, a much easier goal to achieve than Johnson's ever was. Now, in the aftermath of the Paris Peace Accords, a lot of your air leaders look and they go, my goodness, linebacker 2, done in 11 days in December 1972. Less than a month later, the Paris Peace Accords are signed. It's a vindication for Air Force notions regarding the efficacy of strategic bombing. And thus, many embrace strategic bombing and the doctrine that existed before the war, and it stays in place for a long time after the war. In fact, you could perhaps even argue that not only the guys with blue suits and stars embrace that, but the last 4 presidents of the United States today have embraced the new notion of a strategic bomber, that being the Predator and Reaper, and its ability to take out high-value targets. But that's an argument for a different day. For us, to conclude, air power is effective if it can be made to suit the type of war that's being fought, the nature of the enemy you're going against, the nature of the combat environment, and last but certainly not least, if it can be married to the desired political objectives. And that situation occurred, as it says, very rarely in Vietnam. Thank you. I'm happy to take any questions, guys. I'm a target of opportunity, so don't hesitate to fire if you've got the time.
Well, I'll go first. As a British officer in the CSAF's SSG, you and I know each other well, so my intent is not to put a precision-guided weapon on you at this point as a mobile target. The huge debate right now, of course, across our countries and across the alliance from an air power perspective of the application of historic lessons in Syria. I'm going to ask you and put you in a difficult position, I guess, but if you were the president today instead of Nixon, what would your air campaign look like in Syria? And indeed, would you use air power to tackle that particular problem, based on some of the lessons that you've astutely identified from Vietnam?
Well, the idea of a President Clodfelter would be scary indeed. That's for daggone sure. But again, and perhaps with the virtue of some degree of 20/20 hindsight, if I were the guy at the top, we wouldn't be using air power in Syria today. And I would go back to President Obama back in, when is it, 2013. If you're not going to use it when Assad crosses the so-called red line of committing chemical weaponry into the fight, then why do you decide to do it a year later? And I would say the reason that it was decided was because from a seeming groundswell of public opinion regarding 5 people having their heads cut off. And that, to me, is not sufficient rationale in terms of whether it affects the national security interest of the United States to commit air power on a large scale. And you'll notice we haven't committed it on a large scale. You talk about the gradualism of the air campaign in Vietnam. Hell, Vietnam, midway through Rolling Thunder, you're talking 10,000 sorties a month. You look at what we're doing now in Syria, if you even get to 100, that's amazing. And what's it doing? I'm not so sure. I'm not so sure. Again, Syria, Vietnam is a very easy problem compared to Syria. There, you have no ethnic differences, no basic religious differences. Again, you don't have to deal with any of that stuff. And you've got two basic enemies, indigenous and they're receiving support from outside the country. Syria, who are the good guys and who's the enemy? Who's the real enemy? Assad? ISIS? Al-Nusra? Kurdish factions that are, you ask the Turks, they might say, hey, the Kurds are maybe the real enemy here. Again, it's horribly complex. And you can bomb one group and do great benefit to another group that you hate just as much. So unless you have something concrete and specific, I would say don't go with the air power. And of course, ISIL, Al-Nusra, all those guys, including Assad, whether you miss or not, they're going to claim that you miss, and they're going to put that out there for, you know, not just Al Jazeera, but hey, everybody's their own little reporter now with Twitter and Facebook, and you get all the feeds going out. Whether we do it or not, they can make it appear we did it, and that, in fact, I think I read somewhere that now air power is killing roughly 1,000 ISIL insurgents a month. They're also recruiting roughly 1,000 insurgents a month. Okay? So are we getting closer to winning? Are we actually degrading? We're certainly not destroying. I mean, we're certainly destroying, but we're not degrading and defeat. God, I don't even begin to know what defeat or victory means here. I've played with Vietnam for 20 years of my life, and I still don't know what would have been defined as a victory in South Vietnam. Because if you look there and go, oh, well, the South would have continued as an independent regime, and that would have been a good thing? With guys like Key and Thieu and Khan and Diem? Really? I don't know. But I sure as hell don't know what the definition of victory is in Syria. I really don't. And I think that's part of the problem. The guys who were applying military force in Vietnam, they weren't certain of the victory. You know, stable, independent, non-communist South Vietnam? Ugh. Peace with honor? Ugh. Again, I don't know. And thus, if I don't know, I don't want to apply it. Because air power, like every other instrument of military force, is a two-edged sword. And the odds are, in my opinion, in this situation, just as great. You're going to do damage as opposed to doing good. So in this game, I wouldn't play. Yeah?
On the DoD website every day, and some of you are probably familiar with it, you can look at the airstrikes and see what we destroyed. And it'll say one machine gun position or one truck. And it seems like, and then what we've come to find out is that of the sortie count, which are very few to begin with, many of those aircraft, not unlike what you talked about with the bridge, didn't have bombs in them. So it's a very remarkably similar situation that seems to be directed toward a political end rather than a military objective.
There's a great, there's a very good book of oral histories called Strange Ground, and there's an A4 pilot, Pete Solani, who's in there. One of his stories is he was a two-ship of A4s, and they went in and they couldn't really find the target they wanted. But as they were getting ready to go home, they saw 3 Viet Cong on a little road there. And so they made 3 strafing passes at these guys, and he remembered as he pulled off, he looked and they were doing one of these numbers even after they tried it. So yeah, you're going for 3 guys with, let's see, what's the dollar value of the ordnance, the weaponry and all? Yeah. Oh, without a doubt. Yeah. Yeah.
Out of curiosity, one of the books that I've read in the past about the Vietnamese War was very simply a SOF officer who was describing his efforts with the South Vietnamese Army. And what he described was they were in combat, and it was the A-37 Dragonfly that came in and literally bailed him out of a very bad situation. So I'm curious about, in a war like that, just how effective was the South Vietnamese Air Force flying A-1s and A-37s?
If they were well trained and could work with your facts on the ground as well as the facts in the air, then they could do tremendous damage. It just depended on the training. And many of the South Vietnamese pilots also flew, and this was also true of the Americans too. A-1s, your big Sandys, propeller driven, left over from World War II in Korea. They could do a tremendous loiter time. They could be up. They were like the A-10s of the Vietnam era, and they could carry enormous ordnance and loiter for a long time. If you have air superiority, like over the South, where there's no real threat, truly a permissive environment for us, they can do enormous damage, and they were great. Again, your best fights in Vietnam occur in like the Central Highlands, someplace close to the Cambodian border, where you don't have a great number of people. Many of you, I'm certain, are familiar with We Were Soldiers and Young, the Battle of Ia Drang. Greatest thing about Ia Drang is it takes place there close to the Cambodian border. There are no civilians within 50 miles of where that battle takes place. And that was one of the bad lessons, that Air Mobile can go in and do a number. Well, yeah, it can if you have a set-piece battle away from the civilian population. But when you try and duplicate that, closer to the coast where you do have a heavy number of civilians, well, then you can make some bad mistakes, and you can end up, as I mentioned to Gleavy, creating more bad guys than you kill bad guys. And that's the great dilemma there in using that type of air power.
Is that a tactic like you would recommend, say, like in Africa right now, where we have ISIL expansion?
Well, again, it depends on the lay of the land. Is it an isolated area? Do you have them? For instance, Khe Sanh. That's the classic example there in Vietnam, where you really do damage to an enemy force. 2 whole North Vietnamese divisions are blown away by air power, much of it with B-52s. But Khe Sanh's in the middle of nowhere. You've got this Marine base there, 5,000 guys in it, surrounded by 2 divisions, but there's no civilians in that area. So you can go in and just blow the living daylights out of them. So that's great. Plus, they're fighting conventionally. That's even better. It's a siege. If the French had that at Dien Bien Phu, boom. But correct me if I'm wrong there, JP, but the French, in all of the Vietnam War that you guys fought for 8 years, the highest total of aircraft I've seen is 275. And I mean, good Lord, you got to have the firepower. Well, America had the firepower, and that's why we defeat them in the Easter Offensive. They fight conventionally. Great, come to mama. We love it. Every time somebody does, ask Saddam Hussein about how that worked out for him. But again, a thinking enemy, especially one that's waging guerrilla warfare, they're not going to do that. They're not going to play to our strengths. So I would guess there in Africa, if those guys are savvy, and I would expect them to be, they're going to be holed up in a village somewhere or a town close to civilians.
Comment on modern technology as far as lagging behind. I mean, you talked about smart guys, bombs, etc. And Air Force doctrine aside, as far as how to fight the war. You look at today's war fighting as far as even the A-10 close air support wasn't quite ready to be brought online. When the war ended, and then you also have the drones, as far as basically a person could be standing there smoking a cigarette and next thing they're gone. But, that technology has the ability to basically loiter, as you said, hang out for hours upon hours and just basically, like the Ho Chi Minh Trail, just basically hang out and destroy all these supply lines, etc. But, I mean, unfortunately, I've done my own research in college in relation to the Vietnam Air War, and one of the things was you can't take the cadres and the indoctrination and the infiltration out of the equation, as far as you can't bomb that out of South Vietnam. The bottom line is that South Vietnam was so heavily infiltrated with these folks that were basically just waiting for their time.
Yes.
Waiting for us to get out and basically take the country over. I mean, as far as just coming down and quote unquote invading South Vietnam, it wasn't, I wouldn't even think of it as an invasion. It was just basically, you know, the gates just kind of swung open, if you will. You know, they had already infiltrated South Vietnam. But back to the whole modern technology, do you think that would have mattered?
Again, you're fighting somebody that has a tremendous will, a tremendous desire to survive and ultimately take over the country. That guy I mentioned that wrote the book, Trung Nhu Tong, the Minister of Justice, he's got 5 pages in that book describing what it's like to be on the receiving end of a B-52 strike, arc light. And again, the description he gives is just beyond belief. But yet, having survived that, kept on fighting. And hey, being on the receiving end of an arc light strike doesn't break your will, then you've got a hell of a willpower going behind there, as was true of the Viet Cong and the NVA. They were relentless. They were not going to yield. There, again, at the linebacker, you've got the linebacker offensive, and the whole idea that the North Vietnamese had, they didn't really, I don't think in '72, expected to take over the South because you had American air power. They just wanted to plant large numbers of North Vietnamese troops in the South so that when the peace treaty was signed, it was going to be a ceasefire in place, and they kept those guys there. And ultimately there in '75, those guys will form the basis of helping the North to take over. Well, because of that, they continue to wage conventional war all the way until the 23rd of January, '73, when the peace treaty signed. And they are getting the living daylights blown out of them by B-52 strikes, F-4s. I mean, everything is just pounding them. But they continue. And they've got that basis. I mean, a lot of your North Vietnamese army, they figured as soon as they went south, they were dead. That was the mindset they had. So they were going to do as much damage as they possibly could before they went to the great beyond. And if you're fighting an enemy like that, and yeah, I think I might put ISIL and Al-Qaeda in that group, it is damn hard to break their will. Again, as mentioned to Glevy, with pinpricks of air power, much less continual pounding by B-52s. If that doesn't do it, and what we're doing against ISIL now, we'll get onesies and twosies, but we're not going to change the mindset. And like I said, still recruiting the same numbers we're taking out. So yeah, guys die, but others come to take their place. What you say there about the will, the fighting spirit, the esprit, that's crucial, and it's very hard for air power to destroy that. Yeah.
I look at the current world today with all the illegal immigration, and the theory that you just mentioned is like a virus that comes into our country and other countries, and it just grows in latency, and then it expands. And there's no way you're going to handle that with air power.
No, very tough. I mean, you know, you could have put all the drones you wanted to over the Ho Chi Minh Trail, but could you have stopped the movement of that stuff coming down? I say probably not. And again, the unfortunate part there, and I would argue this is probably true for Al-Qaeda and ISIL today, how much do they actually fight on a monthly basis? I'm guessing probably one day a month is maybe for them, or maybe even less than that. So therefore, what do they need? And they don't need a whole heck of a lot. If your combat in frequency is minimal, you know, and you talk about taking out supply lines and stuff of that nature, they don't need the supplies. So yeah, okay, you reduce this. It's like in the Korean War, we took out 95% of the supplies that were going to the 37th parallel, or 13th, or God. Yeah, there we go, 38th parallel. We took out 95% of the supplies coming from China that were going down to the North Korean and Chinese troops on the perimeter. But they were fighting a stagnant conventional war. It was like World War I. You had trench lines and stuff. So yeah, we took out 95%. Did not matter. They had no intention of going forward or backwards. They were just sitting there. So you can do that all, and they did. The Chinese did it all the way to July of 1953. Yeah.
You teach at the National War College. I assume most of your students are military.
3/4 are military and 1/4 civilian. We have a large state population. We also have from CIA, DIA, NSA, your intel guys.
How do our political candidates learn these lessons?
Well, one thing we try to say to the guys in uniform is, you go forth and give your best possible military advice to those that are wearing suits. And if they take it, well, that's good. But you also don't roll over. Be as adamant as you can. And in that regard, one thing I say is we try to teach all of our graduates that can go out and to design competent military strategy for specific political objectives. And thus, if a guy in a suit high up down the food chain says, well, I want to do this, then you can explain to him why this might not be the best way to go. But at that point in time, what will then take over is what Clausewitz referred to as moral courage. And that's the courage, you've got the courage on the battlefield, that's one thing, but then you have the courage where you're going, okay, let me do the calculus here. I'm paying on mortgage, I've got 2 kids in college, then where do you want to go with it? And then that becomes an incredibly individual decision that each person has to resolve for their own. And that's what Clausewitz says. You got to decide then whether you think the cause that you're making, the calculus you've done, and all of the ramifications that's going to do to you, your family, and your career are worth it to go forward. We can provide the tools that can make the arguments as to why something is right or wrong, but then it becomes a very personal decision. And that's always the case, because war is an incredibly personal endeavor at all levels, which is why Clausewitz says that a general must not only understand the political objective that's desired, capital P for politics, but also must understand politics with a little p. That is, this guy's a Democrat, he's up for re-election, and he's looking, that's priority one. You got to understand that too. And thus you can't propose something that you know is absolutely not going to allow him to achieve the goals that he wants. That's like one thing that the military, I don't think, ever understood in Vietnam was just how important the Great Society programs were to Lyndon Johnson. And thus, he did not want public support for the war, because if the public supported the war, that means they're going to say, hey, spend all these tax dollars on protecting our troops in the field versus spending it for, underprivileged people, schools, welfare programs, and stuff like that. So he makes the key decision that he makes to expand American troop totals in Vietnam by almost 200,000 and he makes this decision in late July 1965. He makes that decision at 11 o'clock in the morning, and he goes out. He says, why? Why'd you do it then? He goes, because the only people that are watching TV then are watching soap operas. He didn't want the public to know what he was doing. So there you go. If you're fighting a war, but at the same time, you've got the domestic priorities equal or greater than fighting the war, makes it tough. And yet, a general needs to be politically savvy and understand all of that. It's not easy. What do you say? Everything in war is simple, and the simplest thing is incredibly difficult.
Thank you, Dr. Clodfelter. And the Air Force History and Museums program is very grateful that you came here to speak, and so I'm asking our director, Mr. Grodzinskis, to come and formally express our thanks.
Oh, well.
Again, I want to echo John's comments, and I want to thank you for your presentation, your insightful comments.
Oh, thanks so much,
you.
sir. Thank you. Appreciate that greatly. Thanks.
Thank you.
Enjoyed it, guys.